So tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Dani Shapiro to Politics and Prose. Shapiro is the author of the memoirs Hourglass, Still Writing, Devotion, and Slow Motion, all of which we have up for sale behind our register, as well as 5 novels, including Black and White and Family History. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, Tin House, and many other publications. Many of us, including me, have submitted our DNA to websites to learn more about our ancestry. When Shapiro did so, however, she learned that her beloved deceased father was, in fact, not her biological father. In Inheritance, Shapiro shares her quest to unlock the mystery of her own identity, all the while examining the meaning of kinship and identity. Jennifer Egan, author of Manhattan Beach, writes, "Inheritance is Dani Shapiro at her best, a gripping genetic detective story and a meditation on the meaning of parenthood and family. It raises profound questions about the quandaries and responsibilities engendered by our newfound ability to know what and whom we are made of." Shapiro will be joined in conversation tonight by Jennifer Mendelsohn. Mendelsohn is a seasoned journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate. An avid genealogist, she serves on the board of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Maryland and founded the social media movement known as #ResistanceGenealogy. Now, please join me in welcoming Dani Shapiro and Jennifer Mendelsohn.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. No? Yes? Okay, good. First of all, it's a thrill to be here in the venerable Politics and Prose and to see all of you coming out on this freezing night. It's truly thrilling. This is pretty much the beginning of my book tour. It's I think the 5th stop, so I'm very much not used to it. And it's also it's such a deep pleasure to have Jennifer Mendelsohn joining me. Just before we walked out here, Jennifer said to me, "Can you believe we're here?" Which we'll explain to you in a little while. But for those of you who have not yet read Inheritance, Jennifer plays a pivotal role in my journey. And I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book, and then we're going to talk, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. But one thing I want to say is there was a review this past week from I think it was in USA Today, where the journalist wrote, the critic wrote, "Dani Shapiro is both the best and the worst person for this to have happened to." This really is in so many ways what all of my life as a writer has led to. I mean, all of my life, period, has led to. I joked around very early on that this was the book that I was born to write, but it actually is. And we'll talk about, I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But anyway, it's and actually someone else wrote to me, a friend of mine in Los Angeles that I'm going to be doing an event with, who said, you know, you have this is an experience that could have pretty much done you in, and instead it's turned into your greatest triumph, is what she said. And I don't know about that. But what I do know is that feeling of coming to understand something that was beyond reach, for my entire life, and seeing it clearly, knowing it, and understanding it for the first time is the work of the last 2.5 years, and very, very, I don't even know what to say, liberating, I guess. So this is the beginning of Inheritance. When I was a girl, I would sneak down the hall late at night once my parents were asleep. I would lock myself in the bathroom, climb onto the Formica counter, and get as close as possible to the mirror until I was nose to nose with my own reflection. This wasn't an exercise in the simple self-absorption of childhood. The stakes felt high. Who knows how long I kneeled there, staring into my own eyes. I was looking for something I couldn't possibly have articulated, but I always knew it when I saw it. If I waited long enough, my face would begin to morph. I was 8, 10, 13. Cheeks, eyes, chin, and forehead, my features softened and shape-shifted until finally I was able to see another face, a different face, what seemed to me a truer face, just beneath my own. Now it is early morning and I'm in a small hotel bathroom 3,000 miles from home. I'm 54 years old, and it's a long time since I was that girl. But here I am again, staring and staring at my own reflection. A stranger stares back at me. The coordinates. I'm in San Francisco, Japantown to be precise, just off a long flight. The facts. I'm a woman, a wife, a mother, a writer, a teacher. I'm a daughter. I blink. The stranger in the mirror blinks too. A daughter. Over the course of a single day and night, the familiar has vanished. Familiar, belonging to a family. On the other side of the thin wall, I hear my husband crack open a newspaper. The floor seems to sway, or perhaps it's my body trembling. I don't know what a nervous breakdown would feel like, but I wonder if I'm having one. I trace my fingers across the planes of my cheekbones, down my neck, across my clavicle, as if to be certain I still exist. I'm hit by a wave of dizziness and grip the bathroom counter. In the weeks and months to come, I will become well acquainted with this sensation. It will come over me on street corners and curbs, in airports, train stations. I'll take it as a sign to slow down, take a breath, feel the fact of my own body. You're still you, I tell myself, again and again and again. 24 hours earlier, I was in my home office trying to get organized for a trip to the West Coast when I heard Michael's feet pounding up the stairs. It was 10:30 in the evening, and we had to leave before dawn to get to the Hartford airport for an early flight. I had made a packing list. I'm a list maker, and there were a million things to do. Bras, panties, jean skirt, striped top, sweater/jacket, check weather in SF. I was good at reading the sound of my husband's footsteps. These sounded urgent, though I couldn't tell whether they were good urgent or bad urgent. Whatever it was, we didn't have time for it. Skin stuff, brush, comb, headphones. He burst through my office door, open laptop in hand. Susie sent her results, he said. Susie was my much older half-sister, my father's daughter from an early marriage. We weren't close and hadn't spoken in a couple of years, but I had recently written to ask if she had ever done genetic testing. It was the kind of thing I'd never even considered, but I'd recalled Susie once mentioning that she wanted to know if she was at risk for any hereditary diseases. A New York City psychoanalyst, she had always been on the cutting edge of all things medical. My email had reached her at the TED conference in Banff. She had written back right away that she had indeed done genetic testing and would look to see if she had her results with her on her computer. Our father had died in a car accident many years earlier when I was 23 and Susie 38. Through him, we were part of a large Orthodox Jewish clan. It was a family history I was proud of and I loved. Our grandfather had been a founder of Lincoln Square Synagogue, one of the country's most respected Orthodox institutions. Our uncle had been president of the Orthodox Union. Our grandparents had been pillars of the observant Jewish community both in America and in Israel. Though as a grown woman, I was not remotely religious, I had a powerful, nearly romantic sense of my family and its past. The previous winter, Michael had become curious about his own origins. He knew far less about the generations preceding him than I did about mine. His mother had Alzheimer's and had recently fallen and broken her hip. The combination of her injury and memory loss had precipitated a steep and rapid decline. His father was frail, but mentally sharp. Michael's sudden interest in genealogy was surprising to me, but I understood it. He was hoping to learn more about his ancestral roots while his dad was still around. Perhaps he'd even enlarge his sense of family by connecting to third and fourth cousins. "Do you want to do it too?" he might have asked. "I'm sending away for a kit. It's only like $100. Though I no longer remember the exact moment, it is in fact the small, the undramatic, the banal, the yeah, sure, that could just as easily have been a shrug and a no thanks. The kits arrived and sat on our kitchen counter for days, perhaps weeks, unopened. They became part of the scenery, like the books and magazines that pile up until we cart them off to our local library. We made coffee in the mornings, poured juice, scrambled eggs. We ate dinner at the kitchen table. We fed the dog, wrote notes and grocery shopping lists on the blackboard. We sorted mail, took out the recycling. All the while, the kits remained sealed in their green and white boxes, decorated with a whimsical line drawing of a 3-leaf clover. Ancestry, the DNA test that tells a more complete story of you. Finally, one night, Michael opened the 2 packages and handed me a small plastic vial. "Spit," he said. I felt vaguely ridiculous and undignified as I bent over the vial. Why was I even doing this? I idly wondered if my results would be affected by the lamb chops I had just eaten, or the glass of wine, or the residue from my lipstick. Once I had reached the line demarking the proper amount of saliva, I went back to clearing the dinner dishes. Michael wrapped a label around each of our vials and placed them in the packaging sent by Ancestry.com. 2 months passed, and I gave little thought to my DNA test. I was deep into the revisions of my new book. Our son had just begun looking at colleges. Michael was working on a film project. I had all but forgotten about it until one day an email containing my results appeared. We were puzzled by some of the findings. I say puzzled, a gentle word, because this is how it felt to me. According to Ancestry, my DNA was 52% Eastern European Ashkenazi. The rest was a smattering of French, Irish, English, German. Odd, but I had nothing to compare it with. I wasn't disturbed. I wasn't confused, even though that percentage seemed very low, considering that all of my ancestors were Jews from Eastern Europe. I put the results aside and figured there must be a reasonable explanation tied up in migrations and conflicts many generations before me. Such was my certainty that I knew exactly where I came from. In a cabinet beneath our television, I keep several copies of a documentary about pre-war shtetl life in Poland called Image Before My Eyes. The film includes archival footage taken by my grandfather during a 1931 visit to Haradach, the family village. By then, the owner of a successful fabric mill, he brought my great-grandfather with him. The film is all the more powerful for the present-day viewer's knowledge of what will soon befall the men with their double beards, the women in modest black, the children crowding the American visitors. Someone, my grandfather, holds the shaky camera as the doomed villagers dance around him in a widening circle. Then we cut to a quieter moment. In grainy black and white, my grandfather and great-grandfather pray at the grave of my great-great-grandfather. I can almost make out the cadence of their voices, voices I have never heard, but that are the music of my bones, as they recite the mourner's Kaddish. My grandfather wipes tears from his eyes. In the year before my own son's bar mitzvah, I played him that part of the documentary. Do you see? I paused on the image of the rough old stone carved in Hebrew. This is where we come from. That's the spot where your great-great-great-grandfather is buried. It felt urgently important to me to make Jacob aware of his ancestral lineage, the patch of earth from which he sprang, the source of a spirit passed down, a connection. Of course, that tombstone would have been plowed under just a few years later, but in that moment, my people captured for all time, I was linking them to my own boy and him to them. He hadn't known my father, but at least I was able to give Jacob something formative that I myself had grown up with, a sense of grounding in coming from this family. He is the only child of an only child, but this was a vast and abundant part of his heritage that could never be taken away from him. We watched as the men on the screen swayed back and forth in a familiar rhythm, a dance I have known all my life. So that 52% breakdown was just kind of weird, that's all. As bland and innocuous as those sealed green and white boxes had been. I thought I'd clear it up by comparing my DNA results with Susie's. Now, on the eve of our trip to the West Coast, Michael was sitting next to me on the small tapestry-covered chaise in the corner of my office. I felt his leg pressed against mine as side by side we looked down at his laptop screen. Later, he will tell me he already knew what I couldn't allow myself even to begin to consider. On the wall directly behind us hung a black and white portrait of my paternal grandmother, her hair parted in the center, pulled back tightly, her gaze direct and serene. Comparing kit M440247 and A765211. Largest segment equals 14.9 centimorgans. Total of segments greater than 7 centimorgans equals 29.6 centimorgans. Estimated number of generations to MRCA equals 4.5. Comparison took 0.04538 seconds. What does it mean? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. You're not sisters. Not half-sisters? No kind of sisters. How do you know? Michael traced the line estimating the number of generations to our most recent common ancestor. Here. The numbers, symbols, unfamiliar terms on the screen were a language I didn't understand. It had taken 0.04538 seconds, a fraction of a second, to upend my life. There would now forever be a before. The innocence of a packing list, the preparation for a simple trip, the portrait of my grandmother in its gilded frame. My mind began to spin with calculations. If Susie was not my half-sister, no kind of sister, it could mean only one of two things. Either my father was not her father, or my father was not my father. Hi, Jennifer.
Do these need to be turned on? I'm all nervous, even though I know how it ends. It's like,
So I think we should talk about the moment where you enter this story.
sure, it's not long after you.
No. So it's really not long. I mean, for me to actually be reading that passage from the book and have Jennifer sitting here and to think back to 2.5 years ago, which is not a lot of time, really. But so my husband and I flew across the country to San Francisco. You can't get there from Hartford without landing somewhere else. So we were in airports and kind of moving through time and space. And both of us were on our laptops, like nonstop. My husband's a former investigative journalist, just trying to figure out what was going on. And I can just briefly share that I knew that this meant that my biological father was a sperm donor. I knew that that's what this meant. Once I understood that my father wasn't my biological father, it was the only thing that made any sense, because there was one moment many years earlier. Both of my parents were gone, but there was a moment many years earlier that I remembered with absolute clarity, in which my mother totally did not intend to tell me anything, but let it slip that I had been conceived in Philadelphia. She was triggered by the word Philadelphia. I introduced her to a friend of mine from Philadelphia, and she said, "Oh, my daughter was conceived in Philadelphia." And I was standing there like, what? Usually by the time you're 25 years old, if there's something to know about your conception, you know it. And instead, that came out, and I said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" And she said, "Oh, it's not a pretty story." So then I was really like, "Mom, what are you talking about?" And she did proceed to tell me a couple of things that if she hadn't told me, I would have ended up in swimming in a mystery that I may never have been able to come to understand. And she said, "Your father and I were having trouble conceiving you. Your father had slow sperm. we went to a famous institute in Philadelphia where there was a world famous doctor. These were my mother's words, who had devised a method. This was the very early 1960s. Devised a method by which they could tell when a woman was at the peak of her ovulation, which back then was groundbreaking. He never got credit for it, this guy, for reasons that become clear in my book, but he did have the capacity to do that. And then she said, and I would find out exactly when that was, and I would call your father in New York. My father worked at the New York Stock Exchange, and she said, I would call him on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and he would come racing to Philadelphia. And I said, so why would he come racing to Philadelphia? And said, so we could do the procedure. What was the procedure? Artificial insemination. But she made it very clear to me that it was my father's sperm. And in a conversation that we had later, where I questioned her further about it, she doubled down. It was, can you imagine that your father ever would have been okay with anything other than, in my case, my father was an Orthodox Jew, knowing that his child was Jewish, which of course makes no sense if you know anything about the matrilineal line of Judaism. And also, as my husband later pointed out, she did not answer my question. She asked another question. But this brings me to knowing, to coming to this sort of like, just incredibly intense realization that my father is not my biological father, and that my biological father is a sperm donor, and that I may never know anything more than this. However, we had a couple of clues. And so there was the clue of the Institute. 3 minutes on Google, and we know what the Institute is. There was a first cousin who materialized on my Ancestry.com page, who was a total stranger to me. And he only had initials. And there was the name of someone who what's the word? Administered his account. So here...
Can I interrupt real
yes.
quick? I think what most people are familiar with about taking home DNA kits from the commercials are the ethnicity piece. They're going to tell you that you're not really Italian, you're German, or you're Swiss, or you're, whatever. What most people don't realize, and of course what is much more interesting to people like me who do genealogy, are that you're also given a list of people in the company's database with whom you share DNA, and they're ranked in order of the amount of DNA that you share with them, which generally corresponds to a certain relationship. So Dani's came back that she had a first cousin, and she had no idea who that person was. So you can imagine that was a little bit concerning.
I have a question for you about that too, because people have been asking me this in the last few days and I don't know the answer to it. Do you actually have to check the box saying that you're open to having that list?
Yes.
You do. So
you can opt out.
You can opt out and just simply not know. You just can find out your ethnicity and its breakdown, and that's the end of that.
You didn't used to be able to. That's a new feature in Ancestry. You always were able to do that on 23andMe, but more recently Ancestry allows you to do that.
That makes sense. That's interesting. So we arrive in San Francisco. We've kind of come to the hypothesis that the Institute was on the campus of Penn. So we had this conversation on the flight where we both were saying, what would a profile be of a sperm donor in the early 1960s on the campus of Penn? And we both had the thought, a medical student at Penn. That's all. It was just, I don't know where we got it from. We weren't, watchers of Masters of Sex. We didn't have any, we just both had that thought. And so then we had this first cousin with initials and the name of someone who administered his profile on Ancestry.com. We had this idea, we knew the Institute, and we woke up the next morning and my husband said to me, you should reach out to Jennifer Mendelsohn. And so Jennifer is distantly related to my husband, and that's how he came to know of your expertise and fascination with genealogy. That's how he Because you reach out, you're like,
we're
hey,
also Facebook friends. And as somebody once said, I post about genealogy on Facebook like a CrossFitter, somebody said. So I'm a little enthusiastic. So if you're friends with me on Facebook, you probably know that I do genealogy. But we shouldn't inflate the significance of our relationship. If anyone in the audience is Jewish and has taken a test, approximately 3/4 of all Eastern European Jews who test match each other. Right. It's what's called an endogamous community. We're all sort of basically distantly related. So I happen to have noticed in probably the month before, it was probably when you got your results back, I happen to have noticed that Michael was on my match list as like a very, very distant cousin, but it doesn't really mean that we're cousins. It basically means that we're both Eastern European Jews.
But if you hadn't reached out to him,
right? But I sent him a note. I just sent him sort of a winky face note, like, "Ha, Michael, hi, we're cousins," and he just thought it was funny. And then I think I might have seen that you had tested, or I saw that. I can't remember. We were on GEDmatch, which is the notorious website where that's how they caught the Golden State Killer. I think I just noticed that he was on there. So that's the preface. So then I got a sort of urgent message from Michael. I can't remember. I should have gone back and looked. It said something like, "Something's up with Dani's DNA results. Can you help us?" It was something along. I sort of got I get a lot of these messages, but I sort of knew that something was, amiss. So
yeah, and I think I DM'd you on Twitter and said, "Can you send me or here's my phone number. Can you call us?" It was just so we're in this hotel room in Japantown early in the morning. I guess it was really early in the morning where you were. Yeah.
I can't remember now.
Yeah,
I remember my kids were at camp.
Okay. So
I was home by myself. It was quiet. I had a whole day in front of me, but it didn't take that long.
The speed with which this unfolded it's stunning to me. I don't know if it's stunning to you, but it was.
It's very stunning to me. And I'm almost afraid that people are going to read the book and think that it always happens this quickly. I mean, we identified Dani's biological father in an hour. And I have had cases that I have worked on for literally months and months. I know adoptees who have searched for years. And I feel like I should explain very generally the way. So when you have an unknown parent, whether that's through adoption or sperm donation, or when someone is seeking an unknown parent or a grandparent or any other ancestor who is unidentified that you want to identify, the way that you identify that person is you basically reverse engineer your family tree based on the trees of your matches. And hopefully that makes sense. Meaning the ideal thing is you get a half sibling match. So you say, okay, we're half siblings. That means one of your parents is my parents. It's just a question of which one. If you get a first cousin match, first cousins share a set of grandparents. So you say, okay, one set of our grandparents is the same. Some adoptees test, most adoptees test, and they often have nothing but a third cousin. What that means is somebody like me comes in and builds out that match's tree all the way back to the great-great-grandparents that those two share, and then builds it all the way down and looks for a person in the spot in the family tree who fits the profile of the missing relative. In Dani's case, she had a first cousin match, which is great and a great place to start. So there's very few unknowns in that person's tree. We just needed to find that person's tree. Those of us who do this I think Dani and Michael looked at it and only saw the initials and the name of the person, and they were like, well, where do we go from here? I know exactly where to go from there. So,
well, the name of the person, I mean, there was another just tiny little kind of step there, which is the name of the person. It was two names that both sounded like they could be first names. And when I woke up that morning that we called you, Michael had been looking for that person as the name was listed and was coming up with just complete dead ends. And then he woke up in the morning. When I woke up, the first thing he said to me is, it's not first name, last name, it's last name, first name. And that was when we called you. And then you knew how to unlock get to the family tree of that person, who was in fact the wife of my biological first cousin who was administering the his site?
So I was able to figure out who this person was. And in the wondrous age of Google and the internet, I then very easily found his Facebook profile, which gave the name of the place where he lived. I then, I wish I could say it was like this arduous, long, this is exactly what I did. I Googled his name and that town, and up popped his mother's obituary. And here is exactly what happened. And now, knowing the preface to this conversation, I'm reading the obituary. Remember, they're first cousins. That would suggest that one of his uncles is Dani's biological father. And I'm reading the obituary. It says she is survived by her children and blah, blah, blah. And her brother, Dr. So-and-so of a West Coast town. And we thought, We then Googled Dr. So-and-so of a West. I get chills just thinking about it because the face that popped up was Dani's face. And it was, I've told the story so many times. And
he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania.
Sorry, we forgot that part. And it, his bio was on there and it said he went to medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. And there was just this stunned silence and it was so odd because we're all on speakerphone. I'm sitting in my little kitchen office. They're talking to me on speakerphone from a hotel room, and we're staring at what is clearly the face of Dani's bio. I mean, once you see it, it wasn't like, well, maybe it's like, it's unmistakable. And it was, and then, what I remember was really odd? Hanging up. It was like, okay, well, you guys, bye. Like, it was one of the most, the other thing I realized as I've thought back about it, I now do this a lot. I help a lot of adoptees, find their parents. And I guess I'm never there with them. Like, I just solved one for this 70-year-old woman who's wanted to know who her father was her whole entire life. And it was roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And I was about to tell her that I didn't think I could do it because it was just, and then one night I just, like at 2:00 in the morning, I found him, but she wasn't there on the phone, So then I got to call her the next morning and say, like, I have, really big news. But that we were sort of there together while it happened. It was intense. It was charged. It was extraordinary. We all were just like, what just happened? Like, it was crazy, and then I just remember, like, okay, bye. Like,
well, I actually remember too that, and I write about this in the book. There was, I think you might even have said to me something like, so what are you going to do now? And meanwhile, Jennifer's saying that it was absolutely apparent and obvious that this was my biological father. And I understand that, but it wasn't as obvious to me because it was such a surreal moment. So what I was looking at, he is a retired physician and has a specialty, and this falls into the you can't make this up department, of medical ethics. And he lectures on medical ethics. And so the very first time that I laid eyes on him was a YouTube video in which he was giving a lecture. And I give a lot of lectures. And what I noticed, if I can even call it noticing, what sort of entered me, what I sensed was, he uses his hands the same way I do. And he was doing a Q&A, and he kind of was, I actually said to my husband, he runs a Q&A the same way I do. But it wasn't like I was registering that that I looked like him or that this was real or some. It both answered every question I've ever had and then asked like 10,000 others. So it wasn't there. But I remember Jennifer saying to me, "So what are you going to do now?" And I don't know whether I said this to you in the moment, but I was like, "Well, I'm going to write him," And Jennifer suggested that I might want to slow down, and said there are templates for this sort of thing. You may want to, take a pause. And I didn't, but I've encountered. You probably encounter as well, but I've been, and even before the book came out, when people knew what I was writing about and knew the story, a lot of people who are in this position who either want to reach out in a way, I mean, I recently heard a story where 5 half-siblings found each other. They all figured out who their biological father were, and they all wrote him a note together and sent it to him on Father's Day. You know, it's like that wasn't going to go well. It's so, I mean, if you think about, there's a refrain in Inheritance several times throughout the book in which I ask, how old is too old for a surprise? I was very aware, even though I was in a state of complete shock, I was aware that there was a 78-year-old retired doctor who was going to open his inbox and be stunned, and that it wasn't going to be necessarily welcome, and that it was going to be either something he'd always worried would happen or something that he never considered would happen, but either way. And because I'm a writer, I just figured, like, I know how to craft an email. I'm not going to read a template. And
I was just trying to be helpful.
No, totally. And it was like, I'm sure it was good advice, and it was advice I would give people, because really there's a kind of almost a like a flailing that can happen of just like, I've got to do something. But I also had the capacity to write something that was careful, even though I wasn't feeling careful. I knew how to write something that would put myself in his shoes. And I didn't say much. All I really said was, I think, here's who I am. I am writing because I recently did a DNA test, and I always thought my parents were both my biological parents, and it seems possible that you may be my biological father, and if this makes sense to you, I hope you'll write me back. Pretty much that. Like, didn't say much beyond that. It's... I'm not even sure what to say about that, other than, I mean, in the book also there's a moment where I think about the way that we're in each other's lives. Like, I will always feel incredibly connected to you because you were present on that speakerphone, and in that moment, in the most at the most sort of stunning and like life-shifting moment of my life, and then really, I mean, in the book, it went from the 36 hours in which I found out that my father wasn't my biological father until I was looking at the face of my biological father. But ultimately, for me, that was the beginning of the mystery and not remotely the end of it. The two strands of the story. And ongoing, even though the book is finished, but ongoing for me, I think probably forever, one is the discovery of this relationship with this man who is my biological father, and who are we to each other? I don't want to give away too much of the book, but who are we? What do we owe each other? What did I owe him? What did he owe me, if anything? And what is this strange new world we're living in which these secrets were always kept. They went to the grave with people from the dawn of humanity. They went to the grave with people, and now we're all of a sudden in this moment where they don't anymore, and they can't anymore, and we're in this sliver of time where that is the case, and the secrets are all tumbling out because of the combination of DNA testing being so popular, most popular Christmas and Hanukkah gift for the last couple of years. It's like, happy holidays, everybody. Like, families give these gifts to each other, stocking stuffers. I mean, they like, and the companies, they drop their prices every year right around the holidays, and this is what's happening. And often the secret keepers are still living, unlike what happened with me and my parents. Often the people who were told, never tell anyone this. The child will never know. Go to the grave with this. Don't tell your own parents. Don't tell your relatives. Don't tell anyone. That's over. And so, that's just over. And I believe that 20 years from now, the idea that there ever were these kinds of secrets, and that families kept these kinds of secrets from their kids, and that children grew up not just not knowing their own identity, because sometimes it's just not possible to know, but not knowing that they don't know. I was formed by what I didn't know, but I didn't know that I didn't know. And that, even though it sounds like a word puzzle, is a huge thing. And every single bit of research that I've read everything that's available in terms of the psychological research. People who either discover that they're adopted or discover that they were donor conceived well into their lives, all to a person, it seems to me, report feeling as children that something didn't add up, that there was something that they didn't know, that they felt somehow other or different, and they couldn't put their finger on it, but it didn't, and there was no answer to it. There was no reason. And one of the things that I think happens when there is that sense and that feeling in a child, and you can't put your finger on it, is that you turn it against yourself. It becomes, well, it must be me. There must be something wrong with me. And that was absolutely the story of my inner life as a child. And finally, I understand it. It's really explained to me. But the other strand of it was, what did my parents know? And what were they told? And what was the history of reproductive medicine in this country? And how much can I find out about it? And there was a tremendous sense of urgency for me, because I was very aware that anyone who might have some kind of clue, might know something, been around, known the world famous doctor, known the institute, known my parents. Maybe my mother told her 93-year-old best friend. Maybe my father had confessed or gone to speak with, the elderly rabbi to ask his advice about what to do. I began, my husband and I had this refrain where I don't like picking up the phone and calling people, especially people who aren't going to want to hear from me. I could never really have been an investigative journalist, but I would hesitate picking up the phone to call someone, and my husband would say, he may be dead by Friday. And I would pick up the phone because my desire to know was greater than my fear of being hung up on or whatever. It became, just like a pure, just like the urgency and obsession.
My version of that is in 2013, I had an extraordinary experience we discovered that my husband's 95-year-old Holocaust survivor grandmother actually had 3 living first cousins that nobody had known about. And when I was on the hunt, she was 95, and it was like every time there was a document that I needed to order that might shed light on this, I would be like, how soon can you get it to me? Like, can we rush it, please? Every night I would go to bed and be like, please don't die before we find them. Like, please. And she didn't. We reunited them. It was... But it's funny because I think when you said you feel a connection to me, and I feel a connection to you, of course. We'd known each other sort of through social media for years, but these experiences are like that. I always adored her and had a great relationship with her, but after that, I felt bonded and connected to her. We'd shared. I brought her something that was so special, and I felt it just. All these people that I've helped, some of them are total strangers. I volunteer sometimes, and you just feel like you've played a special little angel role in their lives, giving them something that, there's something about it. There's something about, nothing could substitute for the actual cousins, meaning there's, like, unless it was them, there was nothing that could fill that spot. And when we found them, it was extraordinary. And when we found your father, until it was him, it was not, and then he's there, and it's like, wow, and it's your flesh and blood, and it's powerful.
So I'm wondering if should we open it up to questions? Yeah. What do you think? Yeah?
Just remember to come to the microphone.
Yeah, I've been noticing just in the week since the book is out, or not quite week, that there's a lot of conversation that seems to want to be had around all of these, around all the layers and complexities of all this. Who's going to be first? There's a mic right up here. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a quick question, but it's just there, 23andMe and Ancestry. How accurate are they? Are they scientifically valid?
So we're supposed to repeat the question. So you want to go ahead?
The question is, how accurate are home genetic tests? And the short answer, which I suppose is the one that the situation demands, the ethnicity estimates are, you have to understand, I always tell people, they don't measure something like the pH of a liquid, or, it's not a scientific thing that is determined and you get it and it's that. They're based on reference populations, meaning they tell you you're Irish based on comparing your DNA to people who self-report as Irish. That's why every company comes out a little bit different if you take them. There's usually small differences between, even if the same person tests. I heard one person say, a genetic genealogist, trust the continent. At the continent level, they should be good. So, if you are Eastern European Jewish, you are not going to take the test and be told you're Southeast Asian. That just doesn't happen. But if you're, I think people have unreasonable expectations that they're like, my sister was 0.3% more German than I was. We must not be related. But, so take it with a grain of salt. It will identify for you the broad patterns of your ancestry. The part that is irrefutable, though, is the people with whom you share DNA. I cannot tell you how many people I know who have gotten a surprising result, who then insist on taking a second test, and it always comes out the same way. If a test tells you that someone is your father, they are your father. That's not mistaken. And if a test tells you that you share an extraordinary amount of DNA with someone, you share an extraordinary amount of DNA with that. That is almost never. It's virtually impossible for that to be wrong.
When this discovery for me kind of came in stages, and when I first saw the 52% Eastern European Ashkenazi, which made no sense, I just thought, well, maybe that's the way it is, as I read in my reading. Or I then thought, well, maybe they just got it wrong. This doesn't really make sense. When the first cousin appeared, I continued to be in a kind of, I guess, denial, where I just thought, well, now they definitely just got it wrong because I know all my first cousins. It's so completely, when you have a discovery like this, they call it an NPE, not parent expected discovery, and 14% of people on Ancestry.com, that's of the 7 million people who did this testing on just that one, just with that one company last year, 14% of them came up with an not parent expected. That's a lot of people. Sorry, what was I going to say? So I actually, after my half sister came, very clearly, according to these, the signs and numbers and, greater than and lesser than and most recent common ancestor, once all that came back, and it was sort of irrefutable, I made my husband go call Ancestry.com in Utah, wherever, and they would I guess they
get a lot of those calls.
They get a lot of those calls, and they must have somebody manning the phone 24 hours a day. There was like a manager who was on duty, and said, no, that kind of mistake has never been made in the history of Ancestry.com, which is what was, because can you imagine if they made those kinds of mistakes? These companies would not be, all that would have to happen is that happening once and someone having a nervous breakdown. It doesn't happen.
On the message boards that I read on Facebook, people always say, DNA doesn't lie, people do. Yes.
Yes. So speaking of, you talked about being Irish, the story about Irish earlier. There was a story in the Washington Post magazine earlier this year, and that's very similar, except it's almost the mirror opposite of your story, in which two sisters, similar age, discovered that their Irish as can be father was not Irish as can be, but turned out to be Jewish because he was switched at birth in the hospital. And the hospital would put 16 newborns on a tray with no tags, and they would just...
It was 1912, by the way.
Yes.
To make that clear.
But the crux of that story, which was fascinating as well, is that the father was long dead. And the daughters were relieved in a way that he was long dead, because they did not have to explain that his sense of Irishness, they didn't have to break it to him, because he would have been devastated. In your case, the opposite is true. And I wonder if you, A, had thoughts that this would have been easier, perhaps, that's a terrible word to use, if your biological father was not still alive, and that you could have sort of filled it with the narrative you wanted. As in their case, they you know what I mean.
It's an interesting question and a thought. I am very, very grateful that my biological father was alive and that I was able to meet him, because it filled in some missing pieces of my, ways in which I hadn't made sense to myself were actually just completely present. He did not feel like my father to me. The language that I arrived at a certain point, I mean, I'm a writer, and I don't understand something until I find the language for it. And at some point after I met him, the thought that I had was, it's like he's the country I'm from. And I've never set foot on that country, and I've never eaten its food, and I've never listened to its music, and I don't know its language, but I'm from that country. I thought where you're going with this was whether my father, who raised me, if he had still been alive. Because I have been hearing stories from people who are contending with knowing this for the first time about themselves, and their fathers are still living. And in some cases, and this is there was a story I heard recently that actually had to do with a switched in vitro. The father didn't know. And the father is 80 years old, and the father doesn't know, and the daughter is now going to keep that secret from her dad, who raised her, for the rest of his life. There's so many painful stories, and many beautiful stories too. And beauty and pain not being necessarily, they can coexist. And mine is both. I've thought a lot I've been asked recently, would you have written this book if your father was still alive? And I wouldn't have. And I've never, I wouldn't have. I'd have a completely different story if my father were alive. So I can't even imagine what that would, that thing sometimes that people say, like that game of if you could, have a genie in a bottle, and what would bring somebody back, and what would be the question that you would ask. I have no doubt about that. Now in my own life, I know I would sit my parents down and say, what did you know? How conscious were you of this? How aware were you of my not being, my dad's biological child? But I adored my father, and what I actually really came to and continue to come to in this journey is that I think he did something incredibly brave and difficult by going down that road of donor insemination at that time in order to be able to have a child. And I can't imagine, my parents wanted, they wanted to go to the grave with this, and they did. Now I don't feel any, when I published a piece in Time magazine a few weeks ago that some of you may have read. And when I first saw it, there's this beautiful picture of me as a little girl and my dad on the beach. And I just saw the picture and I thought, boy, oh boy, like when my mother took that picture on the beach in Bermuda or wherever we were, if they could have flashed forward and imagined that picture being in Time magazine, and there's the secret that they kept for their whole lives being, but I'm the only one left and it's my story and I get to tell it. But if they were living, I wouldn't have, or certainly if my father was.
I'll also just throw out that Libby Copeland, who wrote that great story in the Washington Post, is writing a book. And that if you haven't read it, it's an amazing story about the switched at birth babies.
So based on this experience that you've had and all the thought that you've given to it, I'm curious in your opinion about something. Do you ever think there's a justification to keep a family secret?
That is a big question, mister. And there's no simple answer. Another thing that I've become aware of is even though I find it painful and very complex that my parents kept the truth of my paternity from me, and that I grew up every day of my life being told I didn't look Jewish every day. And when I was 3 years old, I was literally the Kodak Christmas poster child, wishing the entire world a Merry Christmas. That was complicated, and I was always told you're other in some way. And what I said before about being sort of formed by what you don't know, that was hard. However, if my parents had some kind of moment where they thought we should tell her, and sat me down when I was 12 or 16 or 20 even, and told me this, at that time, there was no community. I wouldn't have known a soul who was donor conceived, or I very well might have known a soul who was donor conceived, but they wouldn't have known it either, because it was so secret. So I would have been even more of a unicorn than I already felt like I was. My relationship with my father was much closer than my relationship with my mother, and the idea that I wouldn't have been able to even know where to begin searching for the anonymous sperm donor that was my biological father, and that DNA testing had not yet wasn't yet a thing. I don't know that I would have survived that. So I think with family secrets, it's more about when you find them out than that you find them out. I think secrets are really toxic, and just because it isn't said doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think there's a way in which it permeates and leaks into the air around it, and it's noxious. I don't think there could have been a good solution in that case. A secret was kept from me. It probably was the right thing, given my generation, for it to be kept from me. I found it out when I was 54 years old, and in a really solid place in my life. And like you're describing, the was it 70? How old was your
Adoptee? 70.
No, I was your husband's grandma.
95.
95. I mean, to be that, or I just recently heard a story about a 78-year-old woman who just found out that her father wasn't her biological father. When there's not a lot of time to be able to process or sort out or find anything, I feel like I was at the last gasp of being able to actually find people who would be able to shed light on this story for me.
One person I know who made a discovery like this in her 80s didn't want to know, just sort of pushed it aside, not going there. Yes, it's interesting. Close the door.
Yeah, over and out. Yeah.
Hey, big fans of both of you. Thank you for coming here. So I'm a first-generation immigrant. I know my parents' immigrant story really well. They came in the 1980s, so it wasn't too long ago. I even have the date of when they came here. But one reason I've kind of held off on taking an ancestry test is because I know my dad grew up in a village in Western India, and I know because of the nature of the village, I'm sure they probably don't have a lot of record keeping in general. And one thing I've always been curious about when I was hearing you talk about the DNA matching is if there is is there a significant advantage to living in the United States and having, grandparents, great-grandparents come through Ellis Island and have these database records from Americans? Or is there kind of a disadvantage to being from some parts of the world where you just won't have enough data to actually find out enough about your family? I was just curious if that was a general challenge you'd had come across.
It so varies around the world. And one thing that's sort of fun for me, my own family is entirely Eastern European Jewish. So I spend a lot of time, my sort of home base is Jewish genealogy, but I do a little bit of everything. There's a widespread perception amongst a lot of American Jews that there simply are no records. You hear people will tell you that all the time. Oh, I would love to trace that, but everything was destroyed during the war. That's just not true. I mean, my great-great-grandfather's birth certificate is like online. You just have to know where to look. However, I sort of, I watch the genealogy shows like everybody, and I'm always sort of in awe when they get somebody who's like British and they can take them back to the 1600s. Jews did not have last names most places until about 1800. So for most of us, unless you're from a rabbinical dynasty, you sort of stop right about then. So there are limits. It depends on where you're from. There are definitely places with poorer records. There are places with richer records. If your family came prior to about, well, it sort of depends where. Ellis Island opened in 1892. If your family came very early, there are often no records of those arrivals. Ellis Island records got better as they went on in terms of how much detail they contain. A lot of the early ones, like one of my grandfathers came in 1892, actually, and there's just sort of their names and their ages are on. When my last grandfather came in 1920, he had to give the name and address of where he was going and the name and address of his closest relative back home. So those are all clues for people to construct family narratives. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And thank you for your Dan Scavino tweet. It was very entertaining.
Oh, thank you. He said, thank you for your Dan Scavino tweet.
We'll just take these last two questions. I'm just mildly surprised that you've been talking about mostly donor fathers. Your own experience, you went directly to, must be a donor. What do you say about all those cases in which it was not a sperm donor, it was an indiscretion by the mother?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing those stories all the time now, and I mean, as I said, I think this is my sixth event since the book came out last week, and on the signing line, I'm hearing, I found out I had a not parent expected, but it was clearly, my mother had an affair. My mother had an affair with the neighbor. There's a lot of half siblings are emerging that in some cases the father never even knew about, and in other cases did. But there are so many different kinds of discoveries that are happening right now, again, because of this combination of the internet and genetic testing. It's just, and I actually don't know how different emotionally that experience is. I'm imagining it's pretty similar. I mean, I can say that the discovery of being donor conceived has a whiff of strangeness to it, because there's medicine and science and test tubes and institutes, and it's just a little different. But I mean, ultimately it boils down to the same thing, which is that the father that one thought was one's father isn't one's father.
But also, in the one case, the mother is not who you thought she was.
Right. Yes. And yes. Right. What this woman is saying is that in that case, you also find out that your mother isn't who you thought she was as well. And, it was briefly mentioned that I'm launching this podcast next month, February 14th, and it's called Family Secrets. And it came completely as an outgrowth of having written this book. And I was on the phone with a friend of mine her name is Sylvia Borstein. Some of you may be familiar with her. She's a famous and brilliant Buddhist teacher who's in her 80s. And she had just read my manuscript, and it prompted her to tell a story of a family secret of her own to me. And I was on the other end of the phone and listening to Sylvia describe this really haunting family secret, not DNA, it's something else. And I thought to myself, I wish I was recording this. I wish people could hear this, because, and that's how this began. But there are so many different kinds of these secrets, and they're not all DNA related. They're not all paternity related or maternity related. I mean, two of the episodes on my new podcast are about ethnicity and parents just simply lying about it. You know, in one case, a father who passes, another case, a daughter who, actually an affair, and a daughter who is half black, who's raised as a white Jew. And it's just her looks are attributed to a Sicilian uncle, and that's the end of that. It's on. But the thing about these stories is that they're all, when there's a secret, and this is the closest I can get to something that I feel is true thus far, that all the way across the gamut, there's shame beneath it. And the secret is kept because there is shame. There's no other reason pretty much to keep a secret, like underneath it all. And when it's spoken, and I think that that's why this is so resonant right now, when it's spoken, it actually explodes the shame. It obliterates the shame, because basically everybody else around, and it's like the Me Too movement, right? It's like everybody's just saying, yes, me too, or some version of this, or, you know, we're not all so different from each other. And that, the shedding of light on that is, I think, a really remarkable thing.
Did you see the episode of Finding Your Roots with George R.R. Martin? Did anyone see it? It was crazy. So the family story was he was raised in part by his beloved sainted grandmother who'd been abandoned by the ne'er-do-well grandfather who he barely knew. He had been introduced to him once as a child, this Italian grandfather. Well, he does his DNA and he's 0% Italian, and he is not at all a match to what should have been his first cousin on the Italian father's side. It turns out, in fact, that he is a quarter Jewish. So it looks like sainted grandma had actually stepped out on what was maybe not necessarily ne'er-do-well. You know, it changes the whole dynamic of the story. But it was fascinating, and he was just blown. You know, it was like everything he knew about his childhood. This whole narrative: grandma had been abandoned. She was a single mom. She did it on her own. Well, it looks like he left because she had gotten pregnant by another man. So.
So thank you so much. This book means so much to me as a DCP. I hope you can all bear with me a bit here through this. Dani, your exposure and your complete understanding of our donor conception issues. So I'm saying I'm a DCP, that means a donor conceived person. We hope that you will join us on the front lines of our donor conceived people's fight for resources such as mental health counselors and legal assistance, because as you may know, in the US, there is no national donor conceived organization. In Australia, in Canada, in Europe, there are organizations that exist, but because of how things have developed here, we don't have that here. And here in the audience, we have, besides you, 5 other DCPs. And if there are others, please come and find us. We'll connect you to the resources we know through We Are Donor Conceived. So just very briefly, this meant so much to me because your story is quite the inverse of mine in the sense that I was raised Italian and then found out I was Jewish. So it really did, half Jewish. So it did actually have a lot of important information for me. And I really thank you for that. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, will you help be part of our advocacy movement? And will you join with us to try to develop an organization of sorts for our people? And if we could, have you part of our Facebook group as well, that We Are Donor Conceived, that would be great, because you're a very powerful voice for us. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. And when I wrote that Time magazine piece, what I was very aware of is that I feel really strongly about a few things, and I didn't plan on having this voice in the world about this. I didn't know it was my story. You know, what we were all just saying, and what you were just talking about just now, Jennifer, it's we are the stories we tell ourselves. We are the stories that we receive as children, and those stories become part of our narrative, and the stories that we grow up on. And then one of the things that happens when there's a radical shift in what we've understood, whether whether it's being donor conceived or whether it's being discovering a paternal event or it's discovering a huge betrayal of a parent or whatever it is that the story changes. So my story changed, and I'm a writer, so I went inside of that story to do what I do as a writer, which is to try to find a way to illuminate it in language. And so when I wrote that Time magazine piece, it was the one polemical piece that I felt like I wanted to get out there. And what it had to do with, and this is part of it, is that this country continues to have anonymous sperm donors be an option. And one of the things I wrote in the piece is, it doesn't matter whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just not a thing anymore. It's not possible anymore. Anonymity is over. So I just recently advised a close friend who is in her late 30s and is going to be a single mother by choice and use a sperm donor to not use an anonymous donor, because I said, you're setting up your child. It's difficult to be born. Period. We all got here, but it's not easy. And then it's hard to be a human being. It's hard to grow up and go through grade school and go through middle school and be a human. It's a little harder when you've come into the world in a different way. And the entire universe around all of these issues would like to have that not be the case, would simply like to have it not be complex. And I understand that. I mean, parents would like for it not to be complex because they just want to get on with having their family. And doctors would like to have it not be complex because they don't want to think about that part. But so anonymity and disclosure, the idea that parents don't tell the truth to their children about a fundamental right that children have to know either their own identity or that there's a question mark there, whatever it is, to know that. And lastly, this is a country that doesn't have a registry. So there is no registry for the number of offspring that a donor can have. We are the only country in the developed world where that is the case, and Canada. The US and Canada, no registry. So the implications of that are obvious, and it's just beyond, it's terrible that doesn't exist. So I imagine that as time goes on, I will, given that I have a voice in this, continue to be, I'm talking about it right now. This is what I'm going to be doing for the next months as I'm traveling in the country. And I'm speaking at the bioethics departments at Harvard and at Stanford. I am absolutely going to do what I can. And the one thing I want to say to the woman who gave me that challenge is that there is very, very little psychological literature around the long-term impact of being donor conceived. It was like the child was the prize, and now we're done. And because it was a secret, there's very little that's been studied or understood, and I think it's really important for that to be happening, because there are so many of us, so many who don't yet know.
I told Dani earlier that I just heard a story this weekend about a family friend of a friend who was a physician, and one day he sat his kids down and said, "Just want y'all to know you probably shouldn't date anybody in Michigan." He said, "I had to get through medical school. I did a lot of donating. Stay away from Michigan."
Of course, because none of them would have moved from Michigan. It's all just... All right, so this is going to be the last question.
So related to that point, have you identified or tried to identify any genetic half-siblings, and how do you view that relationship? Is it like someone who came from the same country as you sort of conceptualize that father thing, or what does that look like to you?
Yeah, so the question is whether I've been able to identify any half-siblings. And the answer actually in my case, and this is just really interesting to me, is no, which is rare. No, in the sense I have not had half-siblings materialize on 23andMe or Ancestry.com. That doesn't mean they won't, but I think it does mean there won't be many. I do have half-siblings that are my biological father's kids. And And I do have a relationship in particular with his oldest child, who is a daughter, who's close in age to me, 6 years younger, and with whom I have a lot in common, and who was very open and curious and interested in having a relationship with me because she grew up with two brothers and she really wanted to have a sister. So, but we also have a lot in common. Now, do we have a lot in common because we share a biological father, or do we just have a lot in common? I always feel like it's so complex and so not black and white to say, look, I grew up really feeling like my mother might not be my mother. She is. But I didn't feel a bond with her, and she is biologically my mother. I grew up with a father who I felt an enormous bond with, who it turns out was not my biological father. So it's not, we all have siblings that we like or we don't like, or we feel close to or we don't, or we think like, how did you end up in the same family as me? So it's not, there's nothing
My
simple.
brother's here tonight.
Nothing simple about that, but I would imagine, and I think it's probably different for people who discover many half siblings. In the donor conceived community, they're often called dibblings, like donors siblings. I encountered a guy fairly recently who's discovered something like 75 of them. Oh, and I think at a certain point it probably becomes very difficult to feel like, you're the country I'm from, or, where it's getting very crowded in that country. Yeah. So. All right.